Blood splattered onto the stone slabs, leaving dark stains that could not be removed with either lye or lime. The smell of iron, absorbed into the cold air of the hall, mingled with the thick smoke of the torches and the cloying stench of human sweat. None of those present uttered a word, only heavy, hoarse breathing and the faint rustling of clothing as the courtiers tried to keep away from the body lying on the block. No one had expected the execution of the Queen of Scotland to be so long and humiliating. Rumors of Mary Stuart's imminent death began to spread several weeks before preparations for her public execution began at Fotheringhay Castle. Her health, undermined by years of imprisonment, was rapidly deteriorating. The maids allowed into her chambers whispered that the skin on her hands had turned gray and dry, with dark spots resembling those of a corpse, and that her joints were swollen and painful at the slightest movement. According to the doctor's reports, her breathing was labored, with wheezing and rattling, indicating pneumonia. Local doctors suggested traditional remedies, bloodletting, warm wool compresses, and an infusion of wormwood and poppy heads. But all this only exacerbated her general exhaustion. According to one of the chaplains, Maria hardly slept in her final days. She was tormented by visions and nightmares. She complained of darkness that, she said, gathered at her bedside and whispered of the coming judgment. When she was confessed, she often paused, as if losing touch with reality. Some said that this was a sign of piety and fear of God's judgment. Others that her mind had finally become clouded. Reports from English officers noted that the Queen, despite her physical weakness, refused to admit guilt and asked for only one thing: an open hearing where she could speak before everyone. There was a persistent smell of damp stonework in the chambers, mixed with a pungent stench of vinegar, which the maids tried to use to mask the odor of her sick body. The dirty straw in the corner had recently been replaced, but the room still felt musty. A faint light filtered through the narrow window, but most of the time the curtains were drawn tightly to hide the prisoner from prying eyes. Security had been tightened. Troops had been brought to the castle to prevent any attempt at rescue. At that time, the inner circles of the court were torn by disputes. The Catholic nobility secretly hoped for a miracle or the intervention of foreign powers, especially Spain, which saw Mary as an ally. Elizabeth's Protestant advisors, on the contrary, insisted on the speedy execution of the sentence in order to eliminate the threat of a Catholic rebellion. A letter from one of the secret advisors has been preserved, which states explicitly, "Every day of her life is a challenge to the throne. Every breath she takes is a reason for war." In the last days before Mary's execution, she was given large doses of opium decoction to relieve joint pain and ease her breathing. The physician, on the orders of the guards, strictly measured out the dose, fearing that an overdose would be considered secret murder. Servants claimed that after taking the medicine, the Queen lay motionless for hours with her eyes closed, but her lips moved silently, as if she were continuing to converse in her mind. On the night before her execution, according to one of the maids, Mary prayed for a long time, kneeling on the stone floor until her legs began to give way. When she was lifted up, fresh traces of blood were found under the hem of her nightgown. Apparently, old sores on her legs had reopened. She ordered that they not be bandaged, saying that these were the last wounds that this world would inflict on her. At dawn, soldiers entered the execution chamber to escort her to the scaffold. She was pale but stood upright, supported by two women. Witnesses said that her gaze was calm, although her hands were trembling. When she was led out to the crowd, the hall fell silent. The master executioner, a tall man with broad shoulders, was already waiting. Before him lay an axe, its blade glinting in the torchlight. The first blow was inaccurate, the blade entering the back of her head without severing her neck. The crowd gasped, and only the clear voice of the executioner shouting a prayer broke the silence. The second blow was stronger, but still did not finish the job. Only on the third attempt did Maria's head separate, and blood spurted onto the block, flowing into a prepared trough. Witnesses claimed that even after that, her lips continued to move as if she were trying to say a prayer. The body was covered with a cloth and hurriedly carried away. Further preparations for the burial proved difficult. An autopsy revealed signs of long-standing illnesses, diseased joints, inflamed internal organs, and old ulcers. The embalming was carried out in a closed room with no outsiders allowed, but within a few days, a strong smell of death spread through the corridors of the castle. News of Mary Stuart's execution spread through the castle faster than the blood could be washed off the stone slabs. Reports from English officers said that within hours of the sentence being carried out, muffled conversations could be heard in the corridors about who had insisted on such a hasty end to the matter. Some claimed that everything had been decided in a secret council a month before the execution, others that the order had been given suddenly out of fear of Spanish intervention. In London, official messengers sent to Queen Elizabeth brought news that caused her ostensible indignation. According to courtiers, she cried out that she had given no direct order and that her will had been distorted. However, those close to her understood that this reaction was merely a political ploy necessary to avoid open conflict with the European powers. Protestant advisors were satisfied. Mary's death meant that the Catholic threat within the kingdom had been weakened. In Catholic countries, the news caused a storm of indignation. In Madrid, at the court of Philip, it was announced that the execution of the Scottish Queen was sacrilege and a direct cause for retaliation. Spanish priests compared Mary to the martyrs of antiquity and spoke of her death as a sacrifice in their sermons. In France, where the Queen had spent part of her life, her execution was marked by memorial services, although open support could have led to a break with England. Meanwhile, at Fotheringhay Castle, arrangements were made to ensure that the Queen's body was buried in accordance with her status, but without excessive pomp. Protestant officials feared that excessive ceremony would turn the funeral into a demonstration of Catholic loyalty. The services were held in private, and access to the coffins was strictly limited. According to reports from the guards, several of Mary's loyal servants managed to slip Catholic relics and letters into her coffin, which are now the subject of an investigation. During the autopsy, which was performed for embalming, details were recorded that found their way into the medical records of the time. It was noted that the joints of her hands and feet showed signs of chronic gout. Her heart and lungs showed signs of prolonged inflammation, and trophic ulcers were found on the skin of her feet. Doctors explained these injuries as the result of many years spent in damp rooms, lack of exercise, and untimely treatment. Primitive methods were used to slow down decomposition. The body was rubbed with a mixture of wax, resin, and herbs, and the cavities were filled with cloth soaked in strong wine vinegar. However, as later chroniclers wrote, a week after the burial, a foul odor began to emanate from the crypt, and additional insulation had to be installed. The political consequences were immediate. English ambassadors in France and Spain received threats and were forced to request protection. Merchant ships in the North Sea began to be attacked by Spanish privateers, and rumors of preparations for an invasion multiplied. In Scotland itself, part of the nobility related to Mary openly opposed English influence, demanding that her son James be recognized as the sole heir. At the same time, a struggle unfolded in London between those who supported a policy of increased repression against Catholics and moderate advisors who believed that excessive cruelty would only provoke rebellion. Letters preserved in private archives show that immediately after Mary's execution, a list of suspicious persons was drawn up for interrogation and, if necessary, imprisonment. The execution provoked mixed feelings among the people. In Protestant cities, her death was seen as a deliverance from conspiracy, while in the Catholic communities of England and Scotland, she became a symbol of martyrdom. Priests secretly read funeral services, and in markets and taverns, people whispered stories about how Mary walked to her execution with her head held high, showing no fear. Servants who witnessed her last days gave different accounts. Some claimed that she was weak, could barely stand, and was in great pain, while others said that her spirit remained unbroken. One servant testified, "When they led her away, she told us that she was going to a place of rest, where there was no fear or crying." These words were later copied in Catholic circles, giving them an almost prophetic meaning. Shortly after the burial in London, closed meetings began to discuss measures to suppress possible uprisings. Garrisons were reinforced in the north of the country, and additional checks on ships were introduced in ports. But, as one military official noted in his report, the shadow of the executed queen hangs over every council and every market, like a harbinger of doom. After Mary Stuart's funeral, events in Europe began to unfold at an alarming pace. The ink was not yet dry on the reports of her execution when news reached London of the first attacks by Spanish privateers on English merchant ships off the coast of Flanders. Sailors reported that the attacks were accompanied by cries of "revenge for the martyred queen," and that crude crosses and images of Mary were found nailed to the masts of the captured ships. In London, it was understood that the death of the Scottish queen was a convenient pretext for Philip of Spain to accelerate his long-planned invasion of England. In closed meetings of the Privy Council, the possibility of a preemptive strike against Spanish ports was discussed, but it was feared that this would lead to open and full-scale conflict. In England itself, Mary's execution became a point of division. In Protestant parishes, preachers spoke of saving the nation. But among the common people in the north and western counties, where the Catholic faith still held sway, secret leaflets began to circulate depicting Mary as an innocent victim. In some villages, peasants erected stone crosses bearing her name along the roadsides. Soon, these crosses began to be secretly destroyed by order of the local authorities. In Scotland, the situation became even more dangerous. Mary's son, James VI, formerly remained king, but he now found himself in a position where every political concession he made to the English was perceived as a betrayal of his mother's memory. Fearing for his life, James's advisors increased his security and restricted his contact with English envoys. Meanwhile, despite her secret burial, Mary's body continued to be a source of concern for the authorities. A few weeks after the burial at Fotheringhay Castle, complaints began to emerge from guards and servants about a foul odor emanating from the dungeon. Upon re-examining the coffin, it became clear that the embalming had been carried out hastily and improperly, and due to the dampness of the crypt, the fabric began to decompose faster than expected. According to the doctor's report, the skin had darkened and begun to flake off, and the inner lining of the coffin was saturated with liquid. The lid had to be reinforced, and the coffin covered with fresh resin. This fact was kept secret for fear that rumors of the corrupt body of the martyr would cause a wave of pilgrimages. Archival documents from that time contain records of secret negotiations between English and Scottish representatives. They clearly show that London sought to use James's image to stabilize the situation, offering him the future crown of England in exchange for his refusal to publicly condemn his mother's execution. However, James's own letters reveal his hidden discontent and cold detachment. He realized that he had become a hostage in a political game in which his mother's death was just one of the cards. Meanwhile, in the Spanish and French courts, the image of Mary became a symbol of resistance to Protestant England. Portraits of the Queen, with a crown of roses superimposed on them, were sold in monasteries, and in sermons, her execution was compared to the crucifixion. These images quickly spread through embassies and merchant caravans, fueling discontent among Catholic subjects in England itself. Within the English court, the struggle for influence intensified. Some of the Queen's courtiers insisted on the complete eradication of the Catholic faith, while others advocated temporary concessions to avoid rebellion. Among the documents of that time is a note by one courtier, which stated bluntly, "We have cut off the head of the snake, but its body continues to writhe." The situation reached its peak when news of the execution reached Rome. The papal court publicly condemned Elizabeth, and in private conversations, cardinals spoke of the possibility of declaring a crusade against England. In response, London increased diplomatic pressure on the Protestant states of Germany and the Netherlands in an attempt to create a network of allies. But despite all these measures, Mary's shadow continued to hang over England. Women in black cloaks appeared on the streets of London, claiming that the Queen had appeared to them and predicted the downfall of the throne. Merchants told of strange customers ordering hundreds of small medallions bearing her image. Secret meetings sprang up in the north, where her name was spoken as a symbol of hope. By the spring of the following year, it was clear that the execution had not solved the problem, but only accelerated the looming conflict. The Spanish fleet began to gather, rumors of a landing multiplied, and in London, according to the recollections of contemporaries, every evening there was a smell of alarm in the air, heavier than gunpowder smoke. By the summer, barely a year after Mary Stuart's execution, the shadow of her name had finally turned into a banner under which England's enemies gathered. The Spanish Armada, which in the spring had been spoken of only in whispers, now stood ready in the ports of Cadiz and Lisbon. According to reports from English spies, every third ship, among icons and crucifixes, had a portrait of Mary in a mourning frame, and sailors were preached to about revenge for the martyred Queen. In London, preparations were being made for the worst. Fortresses along the coast were being put on alert, and gunpowder and provisions were being stockpiled in warehouses. In towns and villages, checks on Catholic loyalty were tightened once again, with searches, interrogations, and confiscation of property from those who openly revered Mary. In the north of the country, several families were expelled for participating in secret masses in her honor. Despite the outward unity, the struggle for power continued within the court. The advisors who had supported the execution feared that if the war ended in defeat, they would be blamed. Moderate courtiers pointed out that Mary's removal had not brought the promised stability, but had only served to unite her enemies. Letters from private archives of the time contain admissions of fear. We wanted to remove the danger, but we only removed the flesh, leaving the spirit, which now hovers over all the tables of the council. Meanwhile, in Scotland, under pressure from London, the young James VI signed a series of agreements that effectively distanced him from the Catholic party. But these documents did not stop the popular unrest. In Edinburgh and Glasgow, there were several clashes between Protestants and Catholics, in which people were killed. Catholic preachers openly called James the son of a martyr, and hinted that he was obliged to avenge his mother. Rumors of miracles at Mary's supposed burial place multiplied. Servants working in Fotheringhay reported hearing footsteps and quiet singing in the crypt at night, even though the entrance was sealed. The guards were reluctant to serve in the dungeon, and the chief guard wrote in his report, "There is a smell there that does not kill, but penetrates the head, and with it come heavy dreams." Spanish propaganda used these stories, spreading them along with engravings depicting Mary in a halo, with an angel placing a crown on her head. These images even found their way into English cities, despite bans, and in some parishes they were secretly hidden under altars. By the fall, when it became clear that conflict with Spain was inevitable, a legend began to form in London that Mary's execution was necessary to save the kingdom. Writers working for the court chose their words carefully to present her death as a sacrifice necessary to save thousands. However, the paradox was that in Catholic countries, her death was perceived as a sacrifice for their faith, and this image was much stronger. In November, amid military unrest, another inspection of the burial site was carried out at Fotheringhay Castle. The doctor who participated in the examination left a note stating that, despite the tar insulation, the body continued to emit a thick, heavy odor, and the fabric inside the coffin was damp. They feared that if the coffin was opened, the relics would be torn to pieces. Therefore, it was decided to leave everything as it was, and sealed the crypt with a new stone vault. When the sails of the Spanish Armada appeared over the English Channel the following year, the invisible figure of the executed queen, whose name had become a weapon as powerful as cannons, was already in their shadow. Mary's death did not destroy the threat to Elizabeth. On the contrary, it united her enemies, deepened the divisions within the country, and turned an internal problem into an international conflict. The chronicles of the time ended their records with the words, "She left the scaffold, but remained in our hearts. Her death changed the map of Europe